Members, COVID office hours. You'll see that wearing the crown today is Alice Minervino, one of the co-chairs. I'm John Mers, one of the other 4 co-chairs. What you see around my neck is a monkey that's hanging on for dear life, and I think that's symbolic of all of us this morning. There's a lot of things going on, so as we want to do, we'll start with a moment of silence and then jump right into our agenda. So join with me as we remember folks that we've lost to COVID, to folks who are experiencing racial violence, folks who are unsure about the outcome and the future of our nation. So let's just take a big deep breath in and take a moment. Great, thank you. We've got a packed agenda. Just want to remind folks that in this age of isolation, we'd love to see your faces if you're brave enough to put yourself on video. But we do ask that you mute yourself if you're not speaking. We do allow people the option to unmute themselves at any time, but we encourage people to use the chat option if you're using the Zoom feature. If not, if you're on the phone, simply unmute yourself and ask a question. And as we do throughout all of these meetings, we try to be kind to each other, patient, and there's no gotchas. So with that, I will quickly run through the agenda, which is our standard agenda. We only have one update from our partners this time, which is DOH, but we're going to jump into the COVID testing results, and then we're going to spend a lot of time, about 40 minutes, talking about vaccine hesitancy. So that's a great deep dive with our friends from CHC. So I'll just quickly run through these announcements, and just because there's only like one link per slide, don't be deceived. When you click on these links, they're very dense, they're very informative. For example, this one, if you click on it, that gives you options about how are you feeling, and then you click on how you're feeling. Talks about all kinds of resources and things that you can do. So important for you guys to click on these links, but don't let them overwhelm you. The same is true for the next one, which is about protecting your finances. It's only one link, takes you to a website that's got videos and handout materials, and basically it says juggle your bills. So no new information for any of us, but again, good resources for our consumers. The next one is just talking about acuity, and we do this all the time, which is basically what we assess people for their level of acuity, and then we determine the caseloads that make sense. They give 3 options about case manager with folks with high acuity, having less numbers, folks with less acuity, having be part of a larger caseload, and then a mixed. Again, things that we all know, but these are reminders, and especially as we're feeling overwhelmed, sometimes it's helpful to see resources where people have thought through some of our questions for us. So don't get too lost in any of this. This is the winter planning resources. You know, I think most of us have already done this. There's a template. It's really geared toward systems. So I would say that CAN leaders should look at this. And again, it's sort of talking about what are our resources if there's a high surge of folks needing emergency shelter during the winter. What's the plan? Who can provide how many beds, transportation? So sort of helping people think through all the different issues that face us when we talk about providing shelter for folks during the winter. Again, when you click on the link, it's not just one page. It's huge, but a good resource for those who want to quickly run through it. This next one, interesting, but I'm not sure how relevant it is to those of us who aren't in the HVAC business. Sort of talks about and for like an hour and a half. There's a video of these very earnest HVAC men talking about how to prepare your system and change out your filters, etc. Again, it's just a resource that if you own property, it may be good to toss over to your property manager. So those are the updates. Look at them at your leisure, but don't be overwhelmed. It's simply things you may pick up a kernel or two of truth. Steve, welcome.
Thanks. Sorry for being a little bit late, but I had to do an introduction for our homeless outreach RFP rating and ranking. So we're excited that that is actually getting accomplished at the same time as our meeting. So as you know, we certainly have a lot of resources out there, very busy in trying to get them out. So that is a process. And I think that dovetails well with what you were just explaining, John, in terms of cold weather, and homeless services. I think a big part of that will be for DOH to get some of that homeless outreach dollars out there so we can do a better job identifying those individuals and households that may actually be outside, so we can outreach them, bring them in, or at least provide them with the level of service that they desire in their current situation, and with the ultimate goal of putting them on the path to permanent housing. So that's just one piece of what we're doing on the cold weather side. In terms of other cold weather issues, we've certainly been working with the CANs because we are not the experts at cold weather in any individual location. So we've really been relying on our partners to tell us what their true needs are. I think what we found this year has been very difficult to project what those needs are. DOH's goal is to try to ensure that we have at least as many spaces for individuals as there have been in the past years, but we know that for the most part, cold weather overflow shelters tend to be big spaces, which is obviously not conducive at the current time because of COVID. So I think many of the CANs in the beginning really were trying to reconfigure those locations and do what they can in the past. I do believe we'll have a couple statewide, but for the most part, CANs have really come to the conclusion that hotels might be the best option. So I think we're kind of reverting in most places to those options to kind of, ironically, once we got our numbers of the hotels down to 3 or 4, now we're going to start increasing them again. But we do have the FEMA dollars still in place as of today. We are good through the end of the month. We do have to do this every single month and get the approval. However, with the numbers soaring both here and nationally, I do believe that FEMA will still continue to reimburse us for those costs, which allows us to be as safe as we can during these uncertain times. So we'll also be providing the CANs with the service resources needed to be able to staff those hotels, and food and everything that goes with it. So we hope to have at least award letters out to the CANs by tomorrow. Been working on those diligently, but they are complicated because it comes from a variety of different sources. So we want to make sure our partners understand where the money is coming from so that they can figure out how to track their costs, because based on the funding source, there are different rules and regulations that need to be followed. So at least our providers will have an understanding of how we're going to fund it, how we're going to need to get reimbursed, and the documentation that they will need to provide for us to be able to do such activities. So like I said, hopefully we'll get those letters out by tomorrow. We also know things are constantly changing, so we'll certainly be as flexible as we can to be able to work with our partners to be able to manage what they do have and what they are going to need as the winter goes forward. Our intent is to start these efforts on December 1st. So I know that's close, but we have been working on this for a while, and I feel confident that even if contracts aren't in place by December 1st, we at least will have a commitment of funds. So the agencies can go ahead, hire any place that will have hotels. That will not be an issue unless there's an issue with an individual hotel. DAS certainly has been partners with us, and we should be fine on that end. So moving forward, and I think we should be okay. And if anybody has any questions or concerns, just feel free to reach out.
Great, thanks, Steve. Just a reminder or introduction for folks who are new to this call. Steve DeLella is one of the 4 co-chairs. Alice Minervino from DEMIS is one of the co-chairs, and Monique Price-Taylor, who just welcomed everyone in the chat, is our 4th co-chair. So reach out to any of us at any time if you have questions. for the leadership of the BOS COC. So without further ado, our friend Linda Casey is going to make numbers exciting. Yay! Take it away, Linda. You got about 10 minutes.
All right, I'm going to put my timer on. So good morning, everyone. And I was actually hoping to follow the HVAC side because I think that would have made the COVID testing look a lot more exciting. But instead, I had to follow Steve there. So here we go. But I'll make this as exciting as possible because I do have a question for folks based on the testing. As you know, folks have been regularly getting the testing data in there and periodically like to share what it is looking like in our system. So moving on to the next slide, please. Quick agenda. This is looking a lot more busy than it is. I'm just going to talk about high level. How are we comparing to the state testing rates? Talk a little bit about the demographics again, and then talk a little bit about how we're doing as a CAN. And that's really what I want to cover. Next slide. So you hear every day that the governor has a daily testing rate, that you've heard it jump up to 6% last week. It was down to 4%, 2%. What I'm showing here is the cumulative. We do not have enough volume of tests and test cases to actually report on a daily basis. But I want to show you that the cumulative numbers as compared to the state are actually pretty good. But I wouldn't jump too far ahead for any conclusions because I want to show you how many tests we've actually done. So right now, 651 unique individuals have been tested with about 1,200 actual tests. So a lot of folks are getting tested twice. And that's approximately about just under half of the current open shelter enrollments. We've had 27 positive cases. One person tested positive twice. So it's really 26 individuals who tested positive, again, for a total positivity rate of 2%. All I want to show in this slide rather, is that we're doing better so far than the state average. Next slide. So I'll breeze through these. Just folks will certainly get the slides. You can take a closer look at this. But again, if you look at the race and ethnicity of those who are testing positive, and this is the part that I mentioned last time that is concerning, we've got an equal split between the non-Hispanic Blacks and the non-Hispanic whites. Again, the total number of people tested here is 26 unique individuals, but it's half and half. So again, the Black population is testing positive at a disproportionate rate compared to their population. So just wanted to make folks aware this is still the case. And the next slide, I just want to show the age ranges. So your really vulnerable population here that are being tested and testing positive are folks between age 25 and 59. You can see those numbers there in the bar charts. That's all I want to share on this slide. So where have these positive tests been? According to each CAN, this map shows that. You see that Hartford had about 8, this is again cumulative, there are no current positive cases in the state, but 8 in Hartford, 11 in Greater New Haven, and then you see the others kind of smattered around. But I want to also show you that Northwest CAN, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but you see the 0 there and you see 0 for Central. In the next slide, you also see the total number of tests. So Northwest has only recorded 2 tests in HMIS. Again, not trying to call anybody out, but just so people can see how the testing volume is coming into HMIS. You do see that Greater Hartford has the most tests so far with 742 recorded in HMIS, followed second by Greater New Haven at 238, and the others are lower than that. So I want to get to understand what may be happening and why that is. So again, if you test, you will find cases. We know that's the case certainly across the nation and certainly across the state, and that certainly is the case here. But I want to share with you on the next slide that we've had positive tests by each CAN. So I want to show in May was the last time MMW, May 27th was the last time MMW recorded a positive test. August, we had 2 CANs record their last positive test, Fairfield on August 13th, Eastern on August 26th. And then September was the last time, the most recent positive case was Greater Hartford on the 26th of September. Greater New Haven had one earlier in the month. So no positive tests were recorded in October. So again, no positive cases currently in the system. On the next slide, I want to show you that the tests are starting to decrease. The total number of tests that are being recorded, we peaked, as you can see, in June with 319, and again in August, 251. But you can see the trend line is going down in terms of how many tests are actually coming into HMIS. So on the next slide, please. I'm noticing that there are onesie twosies that are being entered into the system. So we have this, I just want to review the ability to have a batch upload feature, but that may not be what's happening here. People seem to be entering, again, perhaps they're manual. I'm getting very few batch upload announcements. When they come, I get an email. Very few of those are coming in, but I am noticing that you can see the last 8 or so dates in October, that the number of tests were entered were onesie twosies, maybe 8 in Eastern on the 14th, but they're coming in very, very in a trickle, so to speak. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes reviewing in case folks understand how the testing is going, and remind people that you can actually get them uploaded if you do a batch upload, if you have testing coming into your shelter or into the hotel, and you are working with your FQHC to get those results, what that process looks like. So just a reminder, the importance of getting into HMIS, I think this is what we just want to circle back on. Nobody else, we will be able to see if a CAN or a certain geographic area is having a spike in positive cases that folks will not be able to see in and of themselves. You might see that maybe you've had, again, if you're testing in groups with testing dates coming in, folks coming in to test everyone in your shelter or in your hotel, and you can see those results, but you may not know that other shelters and other hotels in your area are having the same spike. This is why the importance of getting into HMIS is so critical, because we'll be able to see this. We can look at this data on a daily basis. And we'd be able to inform you and the surrounding hotels and shelters in your area that there is an increase. And as you know, because of the congregate setting, shelters might have a faster spread than in your community. So it's really important just to remind folks to get this data into the system. You can see the link there for the Dropbox. It's as simple as possible. You can go to the cthmis.com. You can find it there. I've included the direct link on this slide. So all you need to do is just have literally the client ID, the date of the test, and the test result, positive or negative. Next slide, I'm not going to go into details here. You can have this, but if you need a refresher on how the ideal COVID testing process is, I put together a little flow chart. You can see with how starting with testing, scheduling a test date with your FQHC can trigger the whole thing, but you really need to share the client IDs with your FQHC so that, and understand that the ROIs will need to be signed from your FQHC, because anybody who's in HMIS we have figured out that ROI is valid, but we have to match up the ROIs from the FQHC so that we can get the results back to those shelter providers. And as it goes through, the results come back, they'll check to see, hey, has this client signed the ROI? And if everything is good, they will send back the list of everybody who's been tested based on that client ID with, again, the test date and the test results. And that spreadsheet can be easily uploaded into HMIS from the links that I shared earlier. So again, you can take a closer look at this. Feel free to reach out if there's any questions. The final slide I have is really just a view of what that file looks like. You can see if you want to add testing location, that's absolutely an option. We'd love for you to add more detail. What we really need is client ID, test date, and test result, but in batch. So I want to pause there. I know I have like about a minute and a half left. And if anybody can just either enter into the chat, I'll check that after I stop speaking, but just help me understand, are people testing onesie twosies? And if so, how are you getting those results? Are people telling you what the results are and you're entering them manually into HMIS? Are there any challenges or problems that you can see in terms of how the process should work in terms of having the testing come to your shelter? I would just like some more information on that. So thank you so much for your time. Hopefully this was not too dreary for folks, but I really appreciate everyone reminding folks how important it is to get the COVID testing data in there and in mass. Thank you so much.
Only you, Linda, can make numbers exciting and pop. But I am concerned because I think what I heard your underlying message is that either there's not enough testing going on or there's not enough testing results going into HMIS. So I would encourage people to chat with you. You can just select Linda, it doesn't have to be to everyone, and just talk to her frankly about what you think the barriers are. because if there were no barriers, it would be happening. So let's identify what the barriers are, and then we can look to see if there are ways to remove those barriers, either from the clients, from the testing sites, from folks entering into HMIS, to make it a more robust reporting system, because I think that, as you said, we need to know the numbers so that we know where the virus is trending. So thank you.
There is a question, John, that maybe Linda can handle right now.
Okay.
It's, can you remind me, do we need a separate ROI to enter COVID results if we are just entering manually in HMIS?
No, the client but the fact that they're in HMIS allows you to put the data directly into the system. When we talk about the ROIs from the FQHCs, that's literally when we have those batch results coming back, because typically the provider will get the results back to the client. The provider, meaning the testing provider, would give the results to the client. By having the client sign an ROI from the FQHC, from the testing provider, then the shelter provider can get all the results that testing did. But for one-offs, absolutely fine. You can enter it right into the system.
Great.
And for folks who are visiting, that's Suzanne Wagner with Housing Innovations, the team that staffs and supports our COC. And make sure that when there's a NOFA, we submit a really good application, and then we get a lot of money to help serve the people that we serve. So the next slide is Linda's contact information. So take a snapshot of that. Reminder that you probably already have the slide deck in an email from Liz from yesterday or this morning. So anything that we talk about or that you see, you've got a reference to already in your email inbox. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to have our friends Marwan Haddad and Casey Harding. Casey and I go back a long time, so it's good to see her. They're with the Community Health Center. And as we cross our fingers around the impending vaccine, we know that that comes with its own set of challenges. And so we want to get ahead of the curve as we start to think about what does vaccine education mean for our conversations with our consumers. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself, Marwan and Casey, and then you can just instruct whoever is doing the slides, like advanced slide, please, and they'll do that.
All right. Hi, everybody. As John said, my name is Casey Harding. I'm the director of the Center for Key Populations at Community Health Center. I wanted to just add really quickly, because it's actually a good segue to Linda's presentation. We do a lot of testing at the shelters for COVID, and we're getting about a 60% response rate from patients who want to be tested. The rest of the clients who are there generally won't get a test. So I suspect that might be why there's a few smaller numbers, but we're working on that. And it's sort of a good segue into vaccine hesitancy, because there are similar barriers to that that we're gonna run through. Marwan and I are both very long-winded, so we're gonna try to just kind of go over these slides briefly. But one thing I did notice is that I totally forgot to put our contact information and our website, which could also give you some information. So if it's okay with everybody, we could email that out later, or I could put it in the chat box. But I want you to know that throughout this whole thing, anything you have that you need additional, we can absolutely help you with later, and we will make sure you have a way to contact us. So Marwan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So hi, everybody. Great to be here. So I'm Marwan Haddad, as everybody said. I'm the medical director, so the medical counterpart to Casey at the Center for Key Populations at Community Health Center, Inc. I've also, since COVID hit, became the chair of our COVID advisory group at CHC. As everybody's doing, I think this is a great topic that you all have asked us sort of to do, because we've started, I think everybody is starting to plan for a vaccine scale up, in hopes that we will get one fairly soon and start to see ourselves out of this pandemic soon. So more to come. As Casey said, we do talk a lot. We'll try to sort of go through quickly. I do speak quickly as well, but I will turn it over to Casey now.
You can advance the slides. So this is just, I'm not going to go through the learning objectives, but this is what we're hoping to cover. Again, anything that you have that's a question, you can contact us later. So let's go to the next slide and talk about vaccine hesitancy. I know that we're really focused on COVID right now, but when we talk about vaccines, we're actually talking about a diverse group of vaccines. And one of the most important ones for people experiencing homelessness is also our flu vaccine, because that has historically been a real issue. And another, kind of super spreader. So when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, it describes a range of feelings that any patient has about concerns around getting a vaccine. And a WHO expert panel says delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccines despite availability of vaccination services involves complacency, convenience, and confidence. And so what we're really looking at is why people would decline a vaccine. And I think, Linda, maybe one of the reasons Linda identified us as someone who would be good for this presentation is because we actually asked the question, if a vaccine was available in the coming future, would you accept it? And only 19% of all the patients at the shelters that we were in said yes. And so that's a little bit concerning. Next slide. So go ahead, Marwan. Sorry.
All right. So as sort of Casey sort of said about the definition, the three main issues around hesitancy are really the three C's that they talk about, which is confidence, complacency, and convenience, right? So I think you have to think about all those three different aspects to when we want to combat vaccine hesitancy and convince people that a vaccine should be taken. So with confidence, obviously that is the trust either in the vaccine itself and or the trust in the provider who's recommending it. In terms of complacency, that really is sort of like the lack of the perception of a need for the vaccine or that its value to what it might protect them against, right? And so we also have to always consider that as part of our discussions. And then lastly, it's the convenience, right? The access to the vaccine. Is it affordable? Is it available? Is it easily available? What about the health literacy around the vaccine itself? Next slide. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the confidence and really talk about the impact of vaccines overall. Now, we're not talking about the COVID vaccine here yet because they're still in phase 3 trials, right? So we hope that we're going to get a lot of information and better information and more information as the vaccines go through the trials and get to the FDA to get approval. But in the meantime, you can see here in this table the impact of the vaccines that have had that have been incredible globally. Right. So if you just look on the right side in terms of the percent reduction in diseases that we've got vaccines for, you can see 100% reduction in diphtheria. All right, 93% reduction in Hep A, 99% in H influenza sort of B, more than 99% in measles. That's starting to change if you remember the pockets of measles outbreak because of this vaccine hesitancy and the anti-vaxxers. Mumps, 8% decrease. You can see polio, 100% decrease. Rubella, so German measles, greater than 99% decrease. Smallpox, eliminated, right? Tetanus, 96%. Varicella or chickenpox, as John sort of just put in the chat there, varicella, chickenpox, is 90% decrease. So these really show you the impact of vaccines and the importance of that. Next slide. So this is just to show you that when they added rubella as part of the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella, that we started to get to global elimination. And and for all intents and purposes, rubella, so German measles, has been eliminated in Scandinavia, US, Canada, the Caribbean, Latin America. Western Europe is setting this as a goal, and control is starting to become better and better in Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Asia as well, that you can see there. So again, the importance of vaccines, putting in that context, I think is always fairly important. Next slide. And this is a newer vaccine that did have a lot of controversy around it, HPV vaccine, right, which was recommended to start, in ages 9 up to age 26. And of course, when it comes to talking about sex, everybody starts to go crazy a little bit. And when you sort of talk to parents about vaccinating your children against HPV vaccine, they just start to refuse it with the idea of, oh, my kids aren't going to have sex. And they will not ever have sex type of sort of response. When we know, right, with HPV, the human papillomavirus is linked to so many cancers, right? From cervical cancer to anal cancer to nasopharyngeal cancers. And since the institution of the HPV vaccine, we have seen not only the HPV that causes the warts, but also the cancer. The neoplasia are cancers, the cervical cancer, the vulvar and vaginal cancers, as well. We're starting to see nasopharyngeal cancers have decreased in major percentages, as you can see there. So really incredible, effective vaccine. But again, that vaccine hesitancy around this new vaccine was the biggest sort of barrier to sort of getting people to get this for it. And now it is now also recommended for males. It initially started out for females, but now it's for both males and females. Next slide. Casey?
Then we're going to jump into complacency. And complacency has to do with action versus inaction. And so looking at not necessarily actively refusing a vaccine, that's about 40% of the population, but really just taking inaction. So one of the reasons we do a lot of flu clinics in some of our more vulnerable populations is because if you present it and it's there, that inaction is less likely to happen. So looking at vaccination anxiety and realizing that even when there is that anxiety, oftentimes people will receive the vaccine if it's offered in an easy way without a lot of barriers. Next slide. So just to give you an idea, I liked this slide because with COVID-19, it's just really telling. First of all, vaccines have a monetary incentive for certain people in healthcare. And also, you know, if you look at those numbers from January to April, and that's just the 4 months, there was a drastic reduction in vaccinations. And, you know, that's going to eventually be an issue when we're all back in congregate settings again and whatever. And I also wanted to show the financial impact of billed charges. So this is not the cost of vaccination, but what a healthcare agency loses when vaccinations aren't occurring. So on both sides, both the health of patients, but also on the financial side for those healthcare agencies. Next slide. And so complacency, again, there are different elements to this. And one of them is the consequence of success. So concerns about the disease risk go down when more people, when it's shown that something like the HPV vaccination has been working. So, well, if everybody else is getting it, I'm probably at lower risk. And of course, we know that's not necessarily true, but it changes the perception of risk. And it also can potentially, when concerns about the risks of a vaccine or vaccine safety, again, the HPV is a perfect example because it was a newer vaccine. And so it took a while for the promotion of education and for people to really learn how impactful it could be. And so the concern about the vaccine safety was very high, while the concerns about the disease were going down because it was showing such success rates. And so it seems sort of counterintuitive, but if you think about it psychologically, it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're sort of getting the highlight reel and not really a lot more information. And this is going to be directly addressed later when we talk about how to educate potential patients on vaccinations. Next slide. So, of course, we want to take a few minutes to really talk about hesitancy in communities of color. And if you look at this, you know, there's been a lot of studies. I liked this study by Kaiser because of the methodology and the areas they did it in, but really 42%, Blacks had 42% lower odds of being vaccinated than whites. That is a stunning statistic. And if you look at that, there were some differences in females and males. So females are definitely more likely to be vaccinated, to accept the vaccination. I added that smoker line because I just thought that was kind of an interesting, that non-smokers were so much more likely to receive a vaccination. And that's kind of an interesting, especially if you look in the Black population. So, you know, again, and the next slide, please. I think one of the most important things, and it's probably the thing that comes to everybody's mind when you think about some vaccine hesitancy, especially in communities of color, is to remember Tuskegee. And, you know, that was a 40-year study that recruited African-American men in Alabama and offered them a treatment, which was actually not a treatment. So you had 399 men with syphilis who were going untreated specifically. 130 men ended up dying, but many, many more had extreme complications, including spouses who died or contracted syphilis. The research was justified by saying that there were no consents for any of this. The research was justified by saying that it was designed not to as a treatment, even though there was a treatment, but to study the long-term disease progression. And, you know, that's kind of a scary thing, and it's kind of scary how it wasn't that long ago that that was allowed to happen. In the nearer future, we've also had other research studies that were conducted, and, you know, inequities that took place. You probably all have heard about Henrietta Lacks, and, you know, her cervical cancer cells have been used and millions of dollars to, you know, used in cultures and things like that. There's all sorts of stories about, you know, a friend of mine was just telling me about the father of gynecology who did unmedicated procedures on women of color. It's just incredible what's gone on. One of the things that CHC does, and a lot of FQHCs, or federally qualified health centers, are doing right now, is the All of Us precision medicine research. And one of the main goals of that is to really recruit communities of color, because we need more diversity in the representation that we're getting of genetics and research and disease progression. And so the emphasis for that study across the country is really to enroll more people of color so that we can have a gauge for how disease progresses, how genetics play a part in different chronic illnesses, things like that. But one of the things that happens with that is that we have to go sort of think outside of the box, because there needs to be some education and some confidence building in those communities. So we're going to churches, we're going to different places, because we need to address directly things like Tuskegee so that we can, you know, build up the confidence of those communities in the healthcare world. Next slide, please. And this is just, again, you know, the reason we're talking about this is really because we're looking at that COVID vaccine, and the most recent study that was talking about that, the two reasons that people gave for that Black people specifically gave were Tuskegee syphilis study and the systemic racism that they feel is a part of the healthcare system. But when you look at who needs that vaccine, you see African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to get COVID. They're 5 times more likely to be hospitalized, and they're 2 times more likely to die. And so this is going to be a community that we really have to focus on. And so somehow we're going to have to work really hard on building that confidence. And of course, that along with that will go the access and those kind of things. But really, I think this is going to be a major barrier that we're going to have to overcome. Next slide. Go ahead, Marwan.
So to continue in that vein, and I think we cannot emphasize enough that that we need to talk about the structural racism in every talk, in every meeting, in everything that we do, because we need to really keep talking about the disparities that are so glaring. And it's only the first step in trying to start to address all these issues from this. And, you know, in many ways, it really needs to sort of overtake hundreds of years of disservice that's been done to a lot of our communities of color, and especially our Black communities, as well as to to gain the trust again, right, of these communities that have been, you know, very much disparaged over generations. And so to continue with these studies around vaccines specifically, this was a survey study that was done looking at perception for the flu vaccine. And I think in many ways, the flu vaccine is going to give us more information about the response to the COVID vaccine compared to, let's say, the MMR or our tetanus shots and so on and so forth, right? Because I don't think we're going to have a slam dunk with the COVID vaccine, unfortunately, right? I don't think we're going to develop a COVID vaccine that's going to be 100% effective or 90% effective. I think if anything, the COVID vaccine will be as effective as the flu. And anybody who's on want to raise their hands, how many people say, oh, have heard, I've gotten the flu vaccine and I've got the flu, or the flu vaccine has given me the flu, right? I don't want to do this again. So it's a much harder sell to sell the flu vaccine than it is to sell, let's say, the tetanus or otherwise. And so I think putting that in that context, I think is fairly important. So among Black Americans, 43% of Blacks were more likely than whites and 26% more likely than Hispanics to perceive the flu as a higher risk for them. And there were 28% more likely than whites and 11% more likely than Hispanics to report that they're going to have a higher risk to get the vaccine, that they'll get a higher risk consequence for the vaccine. And then 50% more likely than whites and 32% more likely than Hispanics to report the lack of trust in the medical establishment. And that's all is from the Tuskegee on down, but even before Tuskegee. Just to sort of clarify for Casey about the Tuskegee, it wasn't that we had the treatment for the syphilis when it started. It's just, it started really like sort of observe what happens to people with syphilis because we didn't have a treatment then, but the treatment became available during the time and was not offered to these men who had it. And that was the biggest problem there compared to that was just unconscionable. But even go back further back, right? During the times of just after the slavery. I mean, the sterility, you know, programs that they did, the hysterectomies and the sterilities that they were doing on women without their consent, on Black women without consent. I mean, it just historically goes back hundreds of years. And so we're not going to be able to change this, you know, because all of a sudden, you know, we now finally all say Black Lives Matter and we're going to change things. This really has to be done day in, day out, you know, month in, month out, year in, year out for us to be able to change things around this. So in all races and ethnicities, being male and being over 50 increased your perception of risk of both disease and the vaccine. And so all this has really told us is that Black Americans perceive themselves to be more at risk for the disease and for vaccine side effects, but trusted the medical community the least. Right, and so in thinking about how we're going to roll out the flu vaccine, but also the COVID vaccine, we need to be addressing all these issues, especially in our minority populations. Next slide. This was the data from the National Health Interview Survey from 2011 to 2016, looking at vaccination rates, and no surprise, right, just keep sort of emphasizing this. Compared to whites, Blacks were 24% lower in terms of the vaccine rates, Hispanics were 19% lower as well, but Asian Americans were 47% higher. Right. So again, cultural sort of approaches need to be sort of, you know, adapted to each of our cultural and ethnic sort of subgroups as we sort of think about this. As Casey sort of mentioned, females were more likely than males to have the vaccines, and with age, right, the older you get, the more likely you're going to get vaccinated. And of course, we know with insurance status, adults with insurance were 79% more likely to be vaccinated, regardless of race and ethnicity, right? So insurance status is extremely important as well, especially in the times of, again, we're all waiting with bated breath as to what's going to happen in our elections. But you know, it could not become more evident in terms of life and death, depending on who's sitting in the White House and in our Congress, in order of looking at ensuring that insurance is available to all our citizens, ensuring that every single citizen and non-citizen, as far as I'm concerned, everybody who's living in the U.S. should be able to have access to healthcare and have access to rights that will sort of get them the best chance in life as possible for us. All right, next slide. This again was interesting, putting this in context. And this actually, I'm presenting it because it was also about convenience, right? So we're talking about the 3 different C's. So this was, I don't know if everybody remembers the H1N1. That was what we were worried was going to be our COVID back then. Luckily, it turned out not to be our COVID, but it was a bit of a big concern when it first came out, right? The Asian flu, the H1N1 vaccine with the flu. Exactly, it could have been, and luckily it turned out not to be. But this was a survey around the H1N1 vaccine. SARS was the one that sort of petered out without a vaccine. Luckily with H1N1, we ended up getting a vaccine and getting it under control. But this was a survey of 1,569 respondents aged 18 and older. They definitely went out and got more of a high representation among minority, ethnic, and racial groups, and those living under the federal poverty level. To really get a sense, knowing that those were the groups that were less likely to be vaccinated. And they found that the H1N1 vaccine uptake was associated with the socio-demographic factors, as we believed, around H1N1 related beliefs, both of its severity as well as their risk of getting it, and whether they were getting the seasonal flu vaccine. And it was strongly associated with age, with being in an urban center, with perceiving the vaccine as safe, and with taking up the flu vaccine as well. And interestingly, in the survey, Black participants were the most likely ethnic and racial group to report having tried to get the vaccine, but found it unavailable. And again, the importance, as sort of Casey was saying, that sometimes that sort of, that sort of complacency you can get over it if you can basically get out there and make sure that it's available in a convenient way to all our patients. Next slide. Casey.
So just to go through quickly, because I want to get to how to present vaccination, and we're running out of time, but the most common reasons that patients reported for not getting vaccinations, and this is very largely based on flu vaccinations, is safety concerns, a lack of trust, wanting more information, religious reasons, and then personal or philosophical reasons. Next slide. So just without going through too much, a lot of the safety concerns were around how many vaccinations do I need? Do I need to get the flu shot every year? People actually have issues with the injection site and feeling like, oh, well, I got a red mark last year when I got it, things like that. The necessity, there's a lot of people who believe that if you get the flu, it's your body's way of working itself out, and it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Distrust of vaccinations, and now that everybody's on social media, I have to have this conversation with my kids all the time because they hear, oh, I'm gonna get the flu if you make me get the flu shot. Those kind of things are just rampant. Norms, other people who we all, peer pressure is a thing until you're 100 years old, and so when you hear other people, that can psychologically affect your willingness, and then obviously religious and personal choice. So next slide. This is you, Marwan.
Oh yes, sorry. So as Casey was saying, we are social beings, right? And we are affected by what's happening within our social and group networks. And so if immunization among your network is a social norm, then people will get it. If it isn't, then we sort of end up sort of leaning down that way as well. Beliefs, attitudes, and motivation about health and prevention, right? So, how much do we focus on preventing disease rather than just wanting to come in when I'm sick and getting a pill and leaving, right? And so all of these are fairly important when it comes to prevention and vaccines. Being knowledgeable and aware of why, where, what, when vaccines are needed. And I think this is something we don't do well on every level that we're going to talk about, from providers on down as a society. And then personal experience with and trust in the health system and provider. We talked about that at length. And then experience with past vaccination, right? I haven't heard it more than with the flu vaccine because we do it every year. And people are like, you know what? I got it last year and I got really sick and I don't want to get it again. Or, you know what, for the last 2 years I haven't gotten it, I've never gotten sick at all, therefore I don't want to get it again. Because when I, all those experiences really color how people are going to make a decision moving forward. Next slide. And this is just to show you, this is quick. So this was a sort of talk about how even one person can sort of start to change the social norms around you. So this was a teenager in Ohio who, despite the parents having said, no, we don't want to vaccinate you, went out on his own and decided to get vaccinated, and it started to inspire others, and it became sort of this domino effect of other people starting to get vaccinated when it became known. And so even one person can start to make a difference in the communities as well. And so, those leaders are very important. Next slide. So talk about medical providers. And I'm a medical provider, as everybody knows, or right? And honestly, we have limited knowledge of vaccine efficacy, right? I think most of us will go in and say, please, it's recommended you get the vaccine. But we don't have all the details around this, right? We don't have the knowledge around the real incidence of reactions to the vaccines, the real data on the efficacy, and the importance of herd immunity and how that sort of influences what they're seeing in the community. And medical schools don't spend enough time on the vaccines as well. And so I think it's not enough when we approach our patients to say, you need this vaccine, but just simply saying it's needed or it's recommended. I think some patients, sure, doc, you tell me what to do and I'll do it, but many patients want a lot more information around this to be able to be convinced to do it. Next slide.
So I'm a huge believer in lessons learned. And so I went through and really looked at the research on what doesn't work in vaccine hesitancy. And some of the stuff was kind of interesting. So some of the things that I would have thought, like a web-based intervention that you could give someone an iPad, but those things are typically not really successful. Social media campaigns, interestingly enough, and I was able to, one of the slides that Marwan just did with that teen was really meant to highlight how that one teen making that decision, influenced his peers. But on the same token, people took that the exact opposite way. So social media is very much interpreted, and it's a perception that people have. And so that was really interesting that social media campaigns don't necessarily always work, because sometimes it just highlights the misinformation rather than the information. Epidemics of vaccine preventable diseases, talking about measles and how now we're back to people getting measles hasn't necessarily worked in getting more people to get the vaccination. I think, again, sometimes we have to look at whether we're giving the the positive proactive information of efficacy versus the awful thing that could potentially happen if you don't. And along that same line, the visual disease graphics. Now this actually, I feel like works for me, but when you see what someone looks like with the measles or the mumps or things like that, like horror stories about how it affected a family, those typically apparently do not work as well as I would have thought. And that's not to say that this doesn't work on any level, but just to give you an idea of some of the what research has shown is not particularly effective. And now we'll move on to the next slide, which talks about successful strategies. And when we talk about that confidence and complacency, we're really looking to build the confidence. So to take a proactive step. So 80% of patients who were surveyed, and this was a huge study, the provider was the pivotal person in their relationship. So when Marwan talks about how they don't really talk about this in medical school, it's kind of interesting because they are the person, your provider is the person who can actually influence this decision so much. So, one of the things we'll look at is how do we make the providers more involved? Looking at the second one, studies have found that people who agreed to be vaccinated, it was because they received some education, again, from their provider or from a nurse. So someone they trusted as a clinical person who had information that they could then trust and take care of. Policy and advocacy are really important. So how accessible do we make this to every patient? How accessible is healthcare in general? Is it part of the normal conversations in healthcare? So are we talking about it when women are in the hospital giving birth, that they need to vaccinate their children? Are we talking about it with frontline healthcare workers. Is the flu vaccine something that came up after COVID, or are we having this as a national conversation? So really looking at how we can influence that, and especially with vulnerable populations, making sure that it's always part of the dialogue, especially for anybody who obviously has is immunocompromised or vulnerable in any way, living in congregate settings, those kind of things. Basically giving information, again, we go back to peer pressure. And, you know, when you find that your peers, so they found that these teens who were making decisions outside of parental consent were making them based on peers who said, dude, I don't want to hang out with you if you're not going to get your vaccination, things like that. So that does increase confidence. And one of the interesting things that I've always found at the shelters when we go in to do, especially flu vaccinations, is if the staff is seen getting tested, then the shelter clients always want to get tested. And it is an automatic that when they see, especially we went to one shelter where the director was sort of the first person, just happened to be the first person. And it almost created just this, oh, okay, I guess I'll go in and do it. So looking at that trusted community partners, you know, we've had a lot of success with our providers saying, well, I got my flu vaccine yesterday, you know, come on in, let me give you yours. That kind of thing is really helps it encourage. Next slide. So presenting information and how we present it is really important. You know, scientific data is great, but it's just not enough. That's not what, you know, I think people just glaze over that. That's not, you know, when you go into my pediatrician, they always give us this big, huge thing about each vaccination and ask me to read it. And I finally gotten up the courage to say, I'm all set, thanks. I don't need to read about the research. I know what I'm doing, you know, that kind of thing. But it's really, you know, more effective too if you have a trusting relationship. So do you have, one of the things we work on really hard at CHC is engaging with our clients on, especially in the shelters, on a level that's a little bit more personal, so that we have those relationships to build on when we need to, you know, kind of encourage these things. As I said, stories and personal examples of, you know, again, even if the shelter director doesn't sit down and get the vaccination, saying that, oh, my family has all gotten their vaccinations. Are you guys headed in to get yours? Again, sharing with families your decision to make, you know, to vaccinate. Visual aids are actually, and positive messaging. You'd be surprised when there was one research study, which I didn't have time to include, but that showed how negatively people perceive the one-pagers on vaccine receipt. And so it's really interesting when you look at what you give as a visual, it needs to be colorful. And that's why I did these slides in such a colorful, because there really is something to that. And our communications team would tell you that that's everything. And then motivational interviewing. So giving people the opportunity to have a question, to acknowledge their fears, to talk about things like Tuskegee and things that may influence communities, and not to hide behind any kind of shame or anything that we don't want to talk about when it may, you know, help someone make a better decision for their health. Next slide.
I'm going to have you wrap up with this one.
Okay.
Sure. Sorry. So the time, see, we do talk a lot, but you do have the slides for the rest of this. So this is just some more tips, right? And I think whether it's yourself, the provider, I think as long as you've got a trusted relationship, you can really convey a lot of these information to convince your clients and your patients. You want to acknowledge the concerns, right? If you brush off the concerns, you've lost them already, right? So you want to acknowledge that there are concerns and you want to address the concerns directly. Remain not judgmental with when you're doing that, because the moment you start to judge people, you know it from everything else, you need to sort of, you know, you've lost the argument already. You want to be knowledgeable about the vaccines. You want to provide what science and evidence we do have, and acknowledge what we don't have, right? We don't have always all the answers, and so I think if there's up there, it's part of acknowledging the concerns. You got to do that too. Discuss the risks and the benefits, and you need to remind and educate people that vaccines are extensively studied before they're licensed, and then they continue to be studied afterwards. Now, when it comes to COVID, right? There's been a lot of the issues around this, right? The idea of, oh my God, Trump wanted to do this so fast. He wanted it for the election. He's taken over the FDA. He's taken over CDC. How are we going to trust everything and anything? And I think we need to continue to trust at least the scientists, and we look at what they're going to be releasing, and we need to stay on top of that as healthcare providers to be able to really truly speak to that moving forward. And that's, I think, it's what we need to sort of know. I know that there's a few slides later on. There's many vaccines coming down the pike for COVID. I think we need to continue to sort of look at which one's going to make it to the finish line first. Depending upon which vaccines and the amount that is available to us, right? They're going to be distributing it differently to the rest of the country, and the amount that are going to be coming in may be not sort of consistent as well. So I think all this information we need to sort of stay on top of and ensure that we know it, so that way we can convey it to our patients and clients, so that way they know what to do once it becomes available. That's it.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Casey's dropped her email in the chat box, so feel free to reach out. The other slides are wonderful and informative, and we may just have you back when we are operationalizing the vaccine rollout. So let's just go to the slide that shows our next scheduled meeting, which is November 20th, is our steering committee, where we do the business of the balance of state COC, and then our COVID office hours, where we talk about things like this, will happen December 4th. So I'm just going to remind you to hang in there, take a deep breath. If you still have a chance to vote, vote early, vote often, vote late, light your candles, and this too shall pass. So be kind to yourself.